Hi, everyone. I'm Jessil Noor of Solutions Journalism Network, and coming to you as part of the course from the Knight Center, A Better Way to Cover Elections, Campaign Reporting that Centers Communities and Solutions. We're joined by a guest who's integrated solutions journalism into their reporting and workflow, and not just chasing the horse race, which is something that we're aspiring to learn in this course. We're joined by Natalia Contreras, reporter covering election administration and voting access for VoteBeat, and in partnership with the Texas Tribune. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So Natalia, you don't cover politics, but really you cover democracy in Texas. Tell us a little bit about your own journey to this beat and how you ended up at VoteBeat.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I actually, in my journalism career, never really focused or never really had the opportunity to cover elections in Texas elections like I do with VoteBeat. I personally had never voted up until this year because I had a green card. And as you know, immigrants with green card holders, we can't vote in the United States unless we're citizens. And so I became a citizen last year. But up until that point, I never voted. And I was actually in a personal level, far removed from elections and voting because of that. So when I saw the opportunity to join VoteBeat and cover elections, I thought, okay, this is going to be a long shot for me, right? But I'm going to shoot my shot and see what I get. I really personally wanted to understand elections better. And I thought, what better way than maybe doing this, as part of my job. And I actually told that my hiring managers that when I applied for the job, that I personally had never voted, that I personally didn't understand this process. And whenever I knew that I was going to have the opportunity to finally become a U.S. citizen and have the opportunity to vote, I wanted to just, maybe have the opportunity to cover this with fresh eyes of someone who had never even been inside a polling location before. And so fortunately, I am here and I'm able to do this. And I have such a much better understanding about our elections process because I do this. But I also always think that there's probably a lot of people out there that are still far removed from the process, maybe because they can't vote or maybe because they just don't understand it. It's a very complicated process and it works differently in each and every single one of our states. So that's kind of how I got involved in this.
And that's really great, and congratulations. And I think there's really no better way to learn how something works until you have to explain it to someone. And that's, as a journalist, you're verifying truths and explaining how things work. So I think that's really fascinating, and that shows. I mean, your work is fantastic. And we've interviewed you at Solutions Journalism Network before because of your work covering this work you're talking about, this work covering elections. And can you talk about most people watching this won't have that same background. They're covering politics, but we want them to do this. We want them to approach what they're how they cover politics differently and sort of step back and look at the big picture and look at things like voting access and look at things like, if their community is facing a challenge with election administration, look at who's doing it better. Or maybe that's something their community is doing really well. That's something that other communities can learn from. So as someone that recently had to dig into all, this whole world, which is far removed, unless you work in it or you have to explain it to someone else, you're not going to spend the time necessarily. You're not going to know it, right? Where should someone start? They live in an area where voting is highly contentious. There's debates on these, the various different things that go into it, and in terms of voting access, we know that those things are changing and laws are changing around the country. Where should someone start if they're trying to begin reporting on this?
Yeah, I think the best place to start is really just figuring out who runs elections in your community, right? Is it the local county clerk? Is it an elections administrator? Is there an elections administration department, that runs elections? Is it the tax assessor? Sometimes the tax assessor is doing the job of all elections, county clerk, and then, of course, like tax dealings in the county. So in the county, who does that? It's different in every state. It's different. It looks different everywhere in every community. Even in Texas, there's always a county that does it very differently than the county next door. So the first thing, if it's a matter of you're covering your local community, who does that and how do they do it and how does it work? Also, our top election officials in the state that we cover, right? Like our secretaries of state usually are the top election official in our state. Having a relationship or communication with them really is important, just to kind of understand how they administer elections for the entire state. And also the political parties. The political parties run elections. They are election officials as well. In Texas, they have become some of my most helpful sources, the political party chairs, with a ton of information that they share with me. And of course, the folks that are out there advocating for the voters themselves and who can connect you with voters who are, voting rights groups, voter advocates. And another group and another section of folks that I'm still trying to kind of build a relationship with, but that's important, if you're covering elections, democracy, is election law, political science scholars, election law attorneys, that understand how laws work in your state. Are also another group of people that could be really helpful, to have as good sources for information to really understand how all of this plays out and how all of this works when the time comes and you're covering an election.
And so in this course, we're helping journalists apply the skills of solutions journalism, that sort of framework, into their reporting, whether it's democracy or politics. And it's not really a new skill. It's a different approach, not just reporting on what's going wrong, not just doing problem-focused reporting, but actually going beyond that and talking about what's working and how we know that, how that's verified, and looking at comparable places, and seeing what we can learn, like what's working, what isn't, what we can learn from the successes and failures. How have you approached this in your work, and talk about if it's been an effective tool to do the journalism you're trying to do?
It is, and I try to think about that with every story that I do. I think in the environment that we're living in right now, and especially with the election laws that keep getting passed, restrictive voting laws also that keep getting passed from state to state, it's become a little challenging for me to look at a place that's doing it right and how maybe Texas can do that, when politics get involved, if that makes sense. But I did work on a story, it's going to be over a year ago, about an elections administrator who tried in a very interesting way to combat all of the misinformation. And this misinformation that comes because people don't understand how our elections work, right? But having kind of he had this kind of open door policy, and kind of had also just a very approachable way in which he did things, and even his critics, were able to trust him and engage with him. And it's something that whenever we told that story, it was something that other election officials, not just in Texas, but across the country, were taking note of, and, reaching out to him just to kind of learn more about how he was doing it. And I've also written stories about, things that the state has done and policies that it has passed. And I have taken a look at how those policies have already been done elsewhere and why they didn't work and why Texas may be set up for it not working. So I know even though that's, not as positive or not building a solution, it's kind of looking at it in a way where it was done over here, and here's why it didn't work. Here's why it was flawed in this other state, and what we may be expecting in Texas in a few years with a policy like this, and replicating it. I recently also wrote a story that was also, show a lawmaker passed a law that aimed to increase voting access and across the state. And we kind of showed why it didn't work in another state, because just like I mentioned earlier, elections in each county look very different. Each county, at least in Texas, has very different needs. And so why it didn't work in another state, and we kind of showed why it was flawed there, and all of the resources that a law like that would need, and that we didn't have here yet. So like I said, it's been a challenge for me to find in this beat, in elections, a story that we could really look at and try to show, okay, here's how it really worked and what we can do, when politics get in the way, if that makes sense.
No, and I think
hard.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really great point. Because if you look at the definition of solutions journalism, it isn't necessarily when things are working, but it's what we can learn, right? And so I think in the political climate, when rhetoric trumps evidence, and we see that we see that across the country, and that's, I think also the media plays a role in it, because if all you're covering is the rhetoric, you're not asking for the evidence. So I think that's very instructive to do. I think it's really important to do. Ask for evidence, and if politicians aren't giving it, then go find it yourself. And I think that's fantastic. And that's something that I think more journalists should be doing. Talk about what the hardest part of that is and how you overcame those challenges, finding evidence and working that into your reporting and looking elsewhere for where things are working or not.
Yeah, I think what has helped, I think if VoteBeat was only covering elections in one state, it would be hard to find other places that have done something similar and how it worked there, right? With this example of this latest law that was passed in Texas, it aimed to increase voting access in rural counties. So it kind of now is forcing small rural counties to extend hours during early voting. And that immediately sounds like, well, that's great. More hours means there's more opportunity for people to go vote. But in one county in Texas, those extended hours forced the county to actually shut down early voting locations, because the county didn't have the resources to pay the many workers that they needed to work those extended hours. So it had the opposite effect in this small county. And like I said, if VoteBeat didn't have maybe reporters and editors that were spread out across the country, I think it would have been a little harder for me to find evidence of elsewhere where a similar law passed actually several years ago, and it's almost the exact same law. And in South Carolina, this law had the same effect. I mean, it forced some counties to shut down early voting locations. They didn't have any resources, any funding to pull this off. But I only found out about that because I had an editor who had, been really close to that part of the news in that state, and then also had sources there who could help me. And so I think that could be one of the challenges, right, that we have to overcome, is like, how do we find the reporting and the data that's there from a different state or from a different place that you're maybe not familiar with? And so I think that's so far been the advantage of VoteBeat, is that we have so many people spread out across the country. I just know that not all newsrooms have that, but also the sourcing can help us overcome those challenges. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, if we have sources at the state level who might have, in state officials go to conferences across the state all the time, and they may also know of a similar instance where a law was passed and how that fared elsewhere. And so the sourcing can also help us overcome that challenge. But that's something that I always think about, is that if I'm only focused in my state, it could be hard for me to just kind of find those examples, right? So I think the sourcing, it's something that's really important that we really have to work at with this beat.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, the importance of building relationships and doing that before election day, spending time, earning trust of your audience, as well as, the important sources in your beat. And so we talked a little bit about what the challenges are and some of the difficulties, but talk about what's rewarding in this work and what you found, what you've learned through this process.
What's been rewarding in this work is, I think it could be, honestly, it could be a challenge to find kind of like the light at the end of the tunnel that kind of lets us know, okay, the work is actually having an impact, or the work is, it igniting a lawmaker to maybe want to change a law that maybe is flawed, right? Like, it could take some time to see that, but it is rewarding to just hear sometimes from readers who understand, or who maybe read the stories and tell us, you know what, I read this and I had one idea about how this process worked, but I didn't understand it in this other way, and the effects that it could have, So the responses that you get immediately after a story publishes from readers has been rewarding for me. And of course, like, long term, I think the impact is too, at least in this beat, is that I know that it's improving voting access, like this law that I was just talking about, this story that I just worked on with the expanded hours for early voting. I know that election officials have felt empowered that we wrote that story, especially in those smaller communities that often get overlooked. And are getting they are right now mobilizing and kind of like gathering data about how many voters actually use this, the extended hours, the amount of money that it took them to pull it off, kind of thing. And they're feeling empowered to now document all of that so that we can use it in a follow-up that we can maybe write ahead of the next legislative session. So I think like people feeling empowered to take action after the reporting, and then also whenever readers learn something about how this is having an effect in their community, has been rewarding, even though, like I said, it's not always immediate and it's not always as clear as you may think.
That's fantastic. Finally, this might be a tough question, but what are you looking forward to the most this election year? We know it's going to draw more attention on your work. So it's going to be a challenging atmosphere for everyone. But what are you looking forward to? What sort of threads are you going to be following? We're in primary season around the country, but we're moving towards the general, which is going to be, interesting for sure.
I am looking forward to having some more access into the behind the scenes of how every part of the process works. I was able to attend an election worker training earlier this year, and it opened my eyes to everything that, people that are checking you in at the polls and like the actual election workers are dealing with. Before that, I was very much always following the elections director, right? The person that was at the top and running the thing. But I was able to see how it worked for the people basically in the front lines, right? The ones that are dealing with the long lines of voters, the ones that are checking them in, all of the steps and everything that they have to follow in order to make sure that everything goes smoothly. That process itself really opened my eyes. So I hope that I have the opportunity to see another part of the process, maybe how mail-in ballots are our process in Texas. I'm looking forward to that. And I'm also kind of looking forward to seeing, I keep mentioning these laws that are getting passed, but just kind of how they are playing out, because our legislature is meeting again next year. And so I am also looking forward to see how all of this that they passed last year is going to play out this year, and whether they're going to try to come back and fix or maybe pass different or more restrictive laws in the coming year. So I just kind of want to observe as much as I can, talk to as many people as I can, and just see kind of how all of this plays out. That's what I'm really looking forward to the most.
And we know that election officials this year are facing unprecedented challenges, and so that's a whole series of stories that journalists around the country can do and see how their communities are affected, and is there something they're doing that's working, or is there something that they can learn from other communities as well?
Right. Yes. And there are a lot of things that are working, but like I said, it's just a matter of, can we be there to observe the behind the scenes? It's just so hard to do that if we are not trying really hard to request that access to that behind the scenes. That really goes a long way.
All right, Natalia Contreras, VoteBeat. We'll link to all your work and the pieces you talked about in the caption for this interview. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.